contracted. Now, in a similar manner then, we can look at education, and education sort of as a regulator of a social economic system. Education and educational opportunity as being expanded or contracted depending upon the social and political situations a nation finds itself in. In other words, educational opportunity is not automatically expanded or automatically given to people just because it's morally right to do so. Education is under the control of a particular set of people or a particular class of people at all times. And that particular set or class of people or race of people expands and contracts educational opportunity according to its particular needs or according to the needs of the state. I often talk in my lectures about what I call European constants. Those things that remain the same despite obvious changes. Now, when you look at the history of our relationship with Europeans, you will note that certain basic things have not changed despite the fact that there appear to be apparent changes, or there appears to have been some progress, particularly in regard to us as African people. For instance, many of us would think in this day and age that we as an African people have a fundamentally different relationship with whites than what our slave great-grandparents had. There are many youngsters today, for instance, when we talk about slavery, will argue that we need no longer concern ourselves with slavery, that this occurred so many hundreds of years ago, and this is not the case today, and that this is really a fundamentally different world that we live in today than before. This is one of the extreme deceptions that we operate on. In a fundamental sense, very little has changed in our relationship to whites since the time we came here as slaves. Why did we come here as slaves? Our major reason for coming here as slaves, or for being bought here as slaves, was to serve the economic interests of white folk, to be their servants and to meet their needs, to live for them and not to live for ourselves. We, during slavery, and the education of black people began during slavery time, not after slavery, but at the very point of slavery. As we often say, the first on-the-job training for black people took place on the slave plantation. The first forms of being educated for particular jobs took place on slave plantation. So how is our being trained for particular jobs today that are still owned by white folk really fundamentally different from our great slave grandparents being trained for jobs, again, owned by whom? White folk. How is it that you're going to school today to work for white folk is really any different from being trained on the plantation to work for white folk? Even though you think then that because you may be studying computer science today, or you may be studying to be a TV newscaster or something like that, even though you may think that's fundamentally different from the role that your great slave grandparents played, it is really not that different. Because as we've indicated, there were more differentiation between slaves than field hand and house servants. Slaves were also skilled people as well. Slaves were iron workers and carpenters and shipbuilders and what we call millwrights. They worked in factories. As a matter of fact, at the end of slavery, in many areas of the South and in this country, there were more skilled black workers than there were white workers. In other words, there were skilled people among slaves, and there were more slaves with skills than there were free white folk. So the idea then that you may be gaining some kind of skill that your parents did not have, or that your great slave grandparents did not have, does not mean that the fundamental relationship between you and whites today and the great slave great grandparents had and white people during slavery time has changed fundamentally at all. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, the major function of the education of black people, whether we talk about education on the plantation, during slavery time, during Reconstruction, or we talk about education right now at this moment, the basic function of education is for African people to serve the interests of white folk, and for African people ultimately to find jobs working for white folk. That has not changed one bit. I don't care what kind of job you may be training for. I don't care where you may think you're going to be working. But in the end, the intention is that we still will be under the rulership of whites. In other words, then, education, just as we referred to welfare earlier, is used to a great extent to regulate the poor, to regulate subordinate people. And therefore, educational opportunity will be expanded or contracted depending on the needs of those who rule over us. If at times they think that they need a larger number of us, they may expand so-called educational opportunity. If, though, the need for educated Africans has been reduced, then you will see a contraction taking place as well. I want you to recognize, for instance, that the issue of our dropping out of school is not the failure of people just to realize that they should stay in school. I argue that the dropping out of African people, African American students, serves a major political function in this system. In other words, our inability or our not completing school serve to maintain the stability, the political, economic, and social stability of the United States. And to test what I'm saying, you need to only ask yourself the question today: are jobs in New York City expanding or contracting? Are there more jobs available today than yesterday? You see, is the city closing down on number of jobs, or is it expanding the number of jobs? Are jobs leaving New York City, or are they coming into New York City? You see, in other words then, where are the opportunities for the increased number of students who will be graduating from New York City schools? In other words, ladies and gentlemen, you have to look at the fact that about 65% of the so-called better jobs in New York City are held by white folk. And yet, at the same time, the number of jobs that are available to both whites and blacks or any other group of people in New York City are shrinking. So New York City is faced with a dilemma. It's faced with a dilemma that says, if we educate a large number of people, where will we have the jobs for these people? And if you are one of those educated people, you've gone through 12 years of school, then gone through 4 more years of college education and so forth, and when you get out you find that there are no jobs, you're going to find yourself in quite a temper. You're going to raise quite a bit of hell. You're going to protest. You're going to create disturbances. So then, in order to block these disturbances from occurring, it is in the city's interest that a large number of people drop out of school. So that when they drop out of school, they can now make the excuse that you're not working because you didn't finish school. Of course, you don't ask the question, would you really have had a job if I finished? But since we accept the idea that you have to finish school and have an education to work, as soon as one says, well, if you had finished, you would have been working, we're willing to then let it go at that.